Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be reading 3 very short sutras all in one episode. These will be, first, the Ñanamoli Thera translation of the Anatta-lakkhana Sutta, then the Thanissaro Bhikku translation of the Kaccānagotta Sutta, and then finally, the a-sutra. We hope you enjoy. First, we will be reading the Anatta-lakkhana Sutta, as it's known in Pali, or the Anatta-lakkhana Sutta, as it's known in Sanskrit. This sutra is traditionally regarded by the Theravada to be the second discourse that the Buddha ever gave after giving his first sermon. The title translates to Discourse on Non-Self, which gives us all we need to know about what it will be discussing. In the Pali Canon, it is part of the Samyutta Nikaya, and it's also part of the Vinaya Pitaka, or the discourses which serve as rules for the monastic community. Let's begin. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Benares, in the deer park at Isipatana. There he addressed the bhikkhus of the group of 5. Bhikkhus. Venerable Sir, they replied. The Blessed One said this: Bhikkhus, form is not self. Were form self, then this form would not lead to affliction, and one could have it of form. Let my form be thus. Let my form not be thus. And since form is not self, so it leads to affliction, and none can have it of form. Let my form be thus. Let my form be not thus. Bhikkhus, feeling is not self. Bhikkhus, perception is not self. Bhikkhus, determinations are not self. Bhikkhus, consciousness is not self. Were consciousness self, then this consciousness would not lead to affliction, and one could have it of consciousness. Let my consciousness be thus. Let my consciousness be not thus. And since consciousness is not self, so it leads to affliction. And none can have it of consciousness. Let my consciousness be thus. Let my consciousness be not thus. Bhikkhus, how do you conceive it? Is form permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, Venerable Sir, they replied. Now, is what is impermanent painful or pleasant? Painful, Venerable Sir, they replied. Now, is what is impermanent, what is painful since subject to change, fit to be regarded thus: this is mine, this is I, this is myself? No, Venerable Sir, they replied. Is feeling permanent or impermanent? Is perception permanent or impermanent? Are determinations permanent or impermanent? Is consciousness permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, Venerable Sir, they replied. Now, is what is impermanent pleasant or painful? Painful, Venerable Sir, they replied. Now, is what is impermanent, what is painful since subject to change, fit to be regarded thus: this is mine, this is I, this is myself? No, Venerable Sir, they replied. So, bhikkhus, any kind of form whatever, whether past, future, or presently arisen, whether gross or subtle, whether in oneself or external, whether inferior or superior, whether far or near, must, with right understanding how it is, be regarded thus: this is not mine, this is not I, this is not myself. Any kind of feeling whatever, any kind of perception whatever, any kind of determination whatever, any kind of consciousness whatever, whether past, future, or presently arisen, whether gross or subtle, whether in oneself or external, whether inferior or superior, whether far or near, must, with right understanding how it is, be regarded thus: this is not mine, this is not I, this is not myself. Bhikkhus, when a noble follower who has heard the truth sees thus, he finds estrangement in form, he finds estrangement in feeling, he finds estrangement in perception, he finds estrangement in determinations, he finds estrangement in consciousness. When he finds estrangement, passion fades out. With the fading of passion, he is liberated. When liberated, there is knowledge that he is liberated. He understands. Birth is exhausted. The holy life has been lived out. What can be done is done. Of this, there is no more beyond. That is what the Blessed One said. The bhikkhus were glad, and they approved his words. Now during this utterance, the hearts of bhikkhus of the group of 5 were liberated from the taints through clinging no more. Okay, that was the Anatta-lakkhana Sutta. What did you think, Docs?
So that was interesting and mostly covering things that we've already talked about elsewhere, but getting into things further here. So this is not going to be obvious to listeners because this is a very text-based thing, but there's a distinction here between not self and not hyphen self. So it seems like it's pointing at a lack of control here. Where form self, one could habit of form, let my form be thus, let my form be not thus. The closest to a controllable skandha, at least by the being involved in it, is mental activity, and our control over that has limits. And I suspect the Buddha could convince me even that limited amount of control is an illusion. So, since we can't control these things, they aren't really us. Is that what this is trying to get at here?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so if any one of the skandhas was a capital S self, and we were that capital S self, he's saying we would have ultimate agency. One of the complicated things about this sort of Hindu definition of Atman and Anatman is that not only is it like a permanent everlasting soul as we would understand it in the West, but it's also having this characteristic of being like a prime mover so that you could essentially shape yourself or the world around you according to your will. And the various Hindu deities in the Hindu pantheon have that ability, and they have that everlasting nature, and they have supernatural powers related to the fact that they have Atman. But since we don't have Atman, and it's argued that nothing has Atman, that's why we can't just decide, okay, I was born in a body that I don't like, let me just completely change it. Change everything from how many arms and legs I have, to how many heads I have, to how long I'm destined to live on this planet without dying and being sick. Let me change the color of my skin, let me change the sound of my voice, let me change the color of my eyes, how much hair I have, etc., etc. And then it goes all the way through each of the 5 skandhas that way, through perception and determinations and mental formations and consciousness, right? These are things that we have, like you say, limited control over. And because of that limited control, we can't really say that any of them has the characteristic of Atman.
Okay, so there's kind of a translation or context disconnect here where what we mean by a self in our current context is not necessarily what was being said in these texts.
That's right.
Okay. Another point that stood out to me is that the bhikkhus all talk about impermanent things being an inherently painful thing. And that really doesn't jive with me just because I understand how infinity works and eternity, the temporal equivalent to infinity, and I don't want to be anywhere near that. Like, the idea of existing permanently, that is a terrifying idea to me. I think any eternal experience eventually becomes hell. But I also get that that's an unusual mindset, and I suspect most people would sympathize more with the bhikkhus here.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's important to remember that part of the characteristic of painful that they're talking about is having to do with the arising of dukkha. So when they say painful, that's sort of a translation issue. It's relating to the cycle of attachment and desire and the arising of what has been translated in English as suffering, pain, anxiety, dissatisfactoriness. And so it's sort of addressing these concerns that people have with the doctrine of anatman. They're like, okay, but that's actually terrifying that I only get so much time. And I've been told by the Brahmanical traditions over there that if I exert myself, then I get eternity. And for them, like you say, having eternal existence is the positive alternative to like disappearing, to being completely extinguished. And the Buddha here is trying to explain that it's not as painful and not as bad as it sounds. You only view it as painful because you don't have control. And that control is a self-oriented way of thinking, if that makes sense.
So the translation here is painful, but we could more accurately call it like causes dukkha?
Essentially, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense, and that I can get behind. So those was the points I wanted to talk about. Anything I missed?
Nope, that does it for me.
All right, then let's move on to the next one.
The next sutra for today is called the Kaccānagotta Sutta in Pali, or the Kaccānagotta Sutta in Sanskrit. And this one also comes from the Samyutta Nikaya of the Pali Canon, and its title translates to Discourse to Mahakaccāyana. If you remember, Kaccāyana is one of the 10 foremost disciples of the Buddha, and in this text, he asks the Buddha what the meaning of right view is. Interestingly, this sutra is quoted in none other than the Lankavatara Sutra, which we are currently reading and discussing.
In fact, after this recording right now, we are going to do another recording of that sutra.
Exactly. This sutra is also highly influential for middle way discourse. Let's begin. Then, Venerable Kaccānagotta went to the Blessed One, and on arrival, having bowed down, sat to one side. As he was sitting there, he said to the Blessed One, Lord, right view, it is said. To what extent is there right view? By and large, Kaccāyana, this world is supported by, or takes as its object, a polarity, that of existence and non-existence. When one sees the origination of the world as it has come to be with right discernment, non-existence, with reference to the world, does not occur to one. When one sees the cessation of the world as it has come to be with right discernment, existence, with reference to the world, does not occur to one. By and large, Kaccāyana, this world is in bondage to attachments, clingings, and biases. But one such as this does not get involved with or cling to these attachments, clingings, fixations of awareness, biases, or obsessions, nor is he resolved on myself. He has no uncertainty or doubt that mere stress, when arising, is arising. Stress, when passing away, is passing away. In this, his knowledge is independent of others. It's to this extent, Kaccāyana, that there is right view. Everything exists. That is one extreme. Everything doesn't exist. That is a second extreme. Avoiding these two extremes, the Tathagata teaches the Dharma via the middle. From ignorance as a requisite condition come fabrications. From fabrications as a requisite condition comes consciousness. From consciousness as a requisite condition comes name and form. From name and form as a requisite condition come the six sense media. From the six sense media as a requisite condition comes contact. From contact as a requisite condition comes feeling. From feeling as a requisite condition comes craving. From craving as a requisite condition comes clinging or sustenance. From clinging or sustenance as a requisite condition comes becoming. From becoming as a requisite condition comes birth. From birth as a requisite condition, then aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair come into play. Such is the origination of this entire mass of stress and suffering. Now, from the remainderless fading and cessation of that very ignorance comes the cessation of fabrications. From the cessation of fabrications comes the cessation of consciousness. From the cessation of consciousness comes the cessation of name and form. From the cessation of name and form comes the cessation of the six sense media. From the cessation of the six sense media comes the cessation of contact. From the cessation of contact comes the cessation of feeling. From the cessation of feeling comes the cessation of craving. From the cessation of craving comes the cessation of clinging or sustenance. From the cessation of clinging or sustenance comes the cessation of becoming. From the cessation of becoming comes the cessation of birth. From the cessation of birth, then aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair all cease. Such is the cessation of this entire mass of stress and suffering. So that was the Kaccānagotta Sutra. Docs, what did you think?
This one was pretty straightforward in that it's not taking as many twists and turns as the sutras usually do. It's setting things up in an order, and it's doing the usual complete list of stuff. It's doing the usual excess of detail that we see in the sutras. But relative to everything else, this is kind of going in one direction and staying on that direction. So this sets up right view as the middle way and non-duality. Understanding that things that we think exist don't exist as much as we think they do, and things that don't exist more than we think they do. So the text is setting up the chain of what follows from that ignorance and then knocking it down in the same order. With right view, one can get away from the cycle of rebirth by cutting it off at the seed. That would be a lot more effective than the more intuitive approach of going from the top down, trying to tackle aging, death, sorrow, etc. first.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that it's interesting that in this sutta, more than others that we have read where the 12 links of dependent origination have come about, they're presented as a pathway that, a student or a disciple of the Dharma must proceed through intentionally. And that makes that causality sort of a deliberate and a sort of, an on-purpose practice rather than just sort of, I do this and then all these dominoes knock over, right? These 12 links of dependent origination are something that somebody has to take apart themselves, and they have to start from, remainderless fading and cessation. And once they do that, it's not like all the others just sort of fall apart. It's like a meditation in the style of the 4 jhanas. You have to do one, and then you have to do the next one, and then do the third one, and then the fourth one. And then you can go back and forth. You can start with whichever one you want after. But first, sort of, it makes the most sense, and it's kind of the most correct to go in order.
And it would also be easier because if you try to tackle birth, aging, and death, sorrow, etc., before you tackle the idea of like craving, which is much further down that line, the previous steps serve as a support for the next step. And so by going from the beginning to the end instead of the end to the beginning, which is the intuitive choice, starting at the beginning, you knock out those supports, and then makes the next step easier because the support is gone.
Right, exactly. I feel the same way. So the part that gets quoted in the Lankavatara Sutra is this portion that says, everything exists, that is one extreme. Everything doesn't exist, that is the second extreme. Avoiding these two extremes, the Tathagata teaches the Dharma via the middle. From ignorance as a requisite condition come fabrications, and then the rest of that part before we start knocking it down. And it's going to be interesting to see, whenever we get to that part in the Lankavatara Sutra, how it is recontextualized. Because here, like you say, this is a very singular, focused, and pointed text that doesn't wander around and doesn't have a lot of narrative information and doesn't have a lot of dialogue on different topics. It's really like an image of one question and one answer. And in the Lankavatara Sutra,
that's not at all the case.
Exactly. It's questions and answers on all kinds of different topics, and there's also some surrounding narrative information and events that happen within the audience and in the place that they're in. And so let's hold that in mind whenever we go back to the Lankavatara and see that again.
All right. Anything else in that one we should discuss?
Nope, I'm all set.
All right. One more.
The next sutra is perhaps the shortest sutra in all of Buddhism, and it's known as the A-sutra. It is very important in the esoteric tradition, and after we read it, we'll be discussing how they understand and make use of it. Let's begin. Ah. So that was the entire sutra. It is just the letter A. A is the first letter of the Sanskrit alphabet, and it's regarded as being the root syllable, or the original state from which all things come into existence. Importantly, it is not an original cause, sort of like a creator material or a creator god, but it is a primordial state, or an original state, which preludes mental projections of distinction and category.
So this one has a kind of playfulness to it that I appreciate. I'm not sure that it's even mathematically possible to have a shorter sutra. Like, could there be a sutra that is just a blank piece of paper sort of thing? I suspect there could be, but I'm not sure how much, actual substance could be drawn from that. Whereas here, this feels like trolling a little bit, like this is kind of a joke, but also if we look at it and try to take it seriously, there is some substance we can get from there after bringing context in from elsewhere. So we've had a lot of discussion in esoteric traditions about, Vajrayana, the cosmic Buddha, being the universe. Everything within the universe is part of Vajrayana. Vajrayana is enlightening, and therefore everything is enlightening. So that would mean that, yes, the letter A or A is enlightening, especially if it's a root syllable for the language.
Indeed, yeah. And it's regarded as being the sort of material substance of the Dharma. So in esoteric, we talk about how Vajrayana is the entire universe, but it's not his physical body. It's actually his Dharma body. And these distinctions of physicality or materiality that we project from our own minds, they are being projected onto a slate, which you could say metaphorically is made of this vibration. So the reason why this one is so important is because it's the sound that you make when you speak before you make any other shape with your mouth to make another sound. So you have to sort of vibrate your vocal cords. And if you leave your mouth slack when you do that, this is what the sound that comes out. And then after that, you sort of shape what you're vocalizing into different sounds and words. And because Vajrayana is preaching the Dharma to himself, his Dharmakaya is sort of like a record that's playing on loop. And, he's the one that's got the headphones on. This is sort of the fundamental, material behind all of those sermons. And those sermons present themselves to us as the various categories, distinctions, materials, small d dharmas that we perceive in reality. And so this sutra is supposed to capture all of that information just in that one syllable, which is very fascinating. I think that this sort of encapsulates the system that's set in place for esoteric Buddhism, because somebody who's never heard of Buddhism or never heard of esoteric Buddhism and doesn't have any context, when they hear this sutra, they would be like, what is going on here? You mentioned it's kind of like funny trolling or like a joke. It's like, yeah, this is almost purposefully obscure. And that sort of speaks to the secretiveness of esoteric Buddhism that we've talked about. You have to learn the secret or hear the secret. You have to be, let in on the joke in order for this sutra to make sense. And that's sort of how they imagine the entire Dharma, right? It's a very Mahayana way of thinking about things, because their whole thought process is that if you practice Theravada, if you practice these simpler, more difficult, lower forms of Buddhism, they're remedial. They're in the process of being let into the secret, and they're doing it badly and inefficiently or whatever. But if you're Mahayana or you're esoteric, then you have been let in on the secret, and you know what this sutra means. And because of that, you know that it can be a rocket ship to Buddhahood in this very lifetime.
It kind of intersects with some game design ideas that I've either been playing with myself or observing other games doing. If a game presents you with a situation where the input and output does not make sense, it is frequently the designer going, hey, look into this further. There is a secret here. And that's kind of doing the same thing here. A person who doesn't know, and we've been talking about Vajrayana and esoteric Buddhism a lot on this show already. So we kind of have at least the knowledge part of the secret. We definitely don't have the initiation aspect. We don't have the lived experience understanding, but we've talked about Vajrayana before. Because of that, I was able to make that link. Somebody who hasn't done that work is going to hear as a sutra and go, wait, that doesn't make sense. some portion of folks are going to bounce off of that and not engage further. And that's fine. There are a lot of other ways the religion has to catch people, but there's a certain mindset that would see this and go, wait, what am I missing? And then through follow-up research, get into things on their terms.
Yeah, it absolutely encourages investigation because it is so obscure and it's enticing. It's like a piece of bait on a treasure hunt, so to speak, or a clue on a treasure hunt. It's something that people don't encounter in other religious texts. There's not a Bible verse or a verse of the Quran or the Talmud that is only one syllable or only one word. And so because of that, they see this and they wonder how it relates. They wonder what it's supposed to mean. They wonder how it's used and stuff like that. And I think that is one of the wonderful parts about it. It's something that gives you just enough to be curious, but it doesn't give you any of the information that you would get from subsequent investigation and inquiry.
So, not sure this is exactly the intention of this sutra, but in the past, we have discussed that reciting and copying sutras is good karma. The existence of this sutra means that technically every time somebody says they're reciting a sutra. So it's kind of a hidden source of positive karma. If you perhaps stretch things somewhat, I'm not sure that it counts if you don't know you're reciting a sutra.
Yeah, you're right that reciting this sutra is very good karma. And even if people don't know that they're doing it, they are absolutely doing it and they're absolutely incurring good karma for it. Knowing that you're doing it absolutely makes a big difference. That makes it so that you are sort of invoking the secret. You're invoking Vairocana. You're invoking this materiality of the Dharma, but you're still actually getting good karma even if you don't know. And also, because this is the root syllable and it's because it's the original sound that you make whenever you vocalize, anytime somebody speaks, they're also actually incurring good karma as long as they're not saying something bad. As long as they're not breaking the rule of speaking abusively, speaking to cause discord, or speaking falsehoods, all these different rules about how you talk that we've encountered in, the previous precepts and the moral rules and regulations that people have to follow whenever they're Buddhists. In those cases, then yeah, even just the act of speaking is sort of living the Dharma, living the materiality of Vairocana's message, and in that regard is actually regarded as good karma as well.
That's neat. I'm not sure there's much more to say about it. Anything that you wanted to talk about that I missed?
Nope, that takes care of it for me.
I would have been a little concerned if I had missed something on a one-character sutra, so that's good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's everything then.
We hope you enjoyed our reading and discussion of 3 very short sutras. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Nick here. Just wanted to jump in at the top of the show to say big thank you to our 2 patrons, Tanner and Wooly. If you would like to join them, you can find us on patreon.com/brightonbuddhism, all one word. Thank you very much for your support, and we hope you enjoy the show. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, producer, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like for us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, a review, or subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com, or find us on Patreon at patreon.com/brightonbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.